What's up, everybody? It's Charles. Today we are going to be upgrading the front brakes on the GTI. This is the front brake kit from Momentum Motor Parts, and this kit consists of Wilwood calipers. These are going to be 4-piston calipers. We have our mounting bracket. This allows us to use the OEM hub and mount this caliper onto it. We also have some Wilwood brake pads. We have our 2-piece rotor set. These actually came assembled. We have our new steel braided brake lines, some hardware, some shims. We're gonna need some brake fluid because we are going to not only have to bleed the brakes because we're installing new calipers, but we're also gonna go ahead and flush the entire brake system. And of course, some brake parts cleaner so that we can have everything cleaned as we install it. And of course, I'll put links to this kit, the parts that we're going to be using, as well as the tools that you'll need down in the description. Before you get started, if your brakes haven't been off in a really long time, not a bad idea to hit some of those bolts that we're going to take off with some rust penetrant. Because we're replacing this stuff, I'm going to actually take all of the caliper and carrier and line all off together. I'm going to start by taking off the flexible brake line that attaches to the hard line. We're going to take an 11mm wrench and loosen the fitting for the hard line. Once you get that fitting loose, I just like to stuff a rag up here to capture any brake fluid out of the hard line. Then we'll take the flex line. We will roll up an old earplug and just set it in there. It won't prevent it 100% from leaking, but it will also help not make a mess. Next, we'll get a big flat blade screwdriver, slide the brake hose out of the retainer. Next, we'll take the two 17mm bolts that hold the caliper carrier to the hub. I'm going to leave the caliper on the carrier though. We are actually going to be reusing these bolts for the kit to install the brackets to the caliper, so don't lose these bolts. And if they're questionable as far as damage or anything, go ahead and replace them. We can take this whole unit and get it out of the way. Next, we'll remove our Phillips head screw that's holding the rotor on. Your rotor may need a couple whacks with a hammer in order to come off. This one fell off pretty much. Go ahead and slide our rotor off. Before going any further, if you have any dirt or debris on the hub, you need to clean it using something like a wire wheel or a wire brush and get as much oxidation and stuff as you can off of this hub. If you don't, you can have an uneven mating surface for the rotor face, and that can cause increased lateral runout on your brand new rotors. Also, if you live in a heavily rust or salt area, go ahead and put a little bit of anti-seize on this hub. Before we start test fitting any of our components, we want to clean the mating surface where the new caliper carrier is going to mount to the hub. Take a little sandpaper or Scotch-Brite and just clean that off. That way, if there's any rust or anything, we don't have to worry about that affecting how our caliper mounts to our hub. Before installing that new rotor, we want to take a minute and clean any oil or dirt off of the rotor face. Using some brake clean in a towel works really, really well. If they're heavily oiled or kind of dirty, take some Scotch-Brite and scrub it and then clean it again with brake cleaner. For the most part on brakes, the better job we do cleaning, the better brake job we're going to do. Let's install our pretty rotor disc. Now, if your car has lug nuts, you can use an open-end lug nut and slip it over a stud to hold the rotor in place. We have wheel bolts, so I'm going to actually use an old drain plug to hold this rotor in place. This will keep it from flopping all around while we work. We'll take our Phillips head screw, install that. Next, we need to put our caliper and our bracket assembly together. What we'll do is we'll set our caliper upside down. We'll set our bracket to the back of it. We'll start both bolts. Notice the bolt has a washer on it. Go ahead and snug these down. We don't want to put any Loctite or really torque these yet because we need to do some test fitting of this unit and make sure that the caliper has the rotor centered in the middle. All right, so here is our caliper with our bracket installed. Let's go install it on the car using our old caliper carrier bolts and see how the rotor fits in the center of the caliper. Hold the caliper in place. We do not have any pads installed in this at this time. Remember, this is just our test fitting stage. All right, our rotor and caliper are installed. What we're going to look for next is to be sure that the rotor is centered on the caliper. The best way to do that is to turn the wheel all the way to the side we're working on, and that exposes the rotor and caliper a little bit easier. When we look at it here and compare this silver section of the caliper, it's actually over this way just a little more than it is this way. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the caliper and carrier off and install a spacer right here between the carrier and the caliper to move the whole unit this way towards the outside of the vehicle. That should center our caliper to our rotor. All right, let's go ahead and take our bolts for our carrier off. This is why I didn't want to crank down on them too hard. I figured we'd have to take this back apart after doing a test fitting. Even though this was a kit meant specifically for the car, it's not uncommon for things not to fit perfect, so I always like to do test fitting on stuff like this. This kit actually came with 4 different size washers for us to use to space that out. I'm going to put the 1mm ones on because I think this is probably the one that's going to get us right there. So where these go is these go between the caliper and the carrier. So we'll set those down. And the other one, snug them down. Now let's take this back over to the car and see how it looks. Got our new caliper on. Let's check that same measurement that we were looking at before. And so I'm standing directly behind the camera looking at the measurement here to this silver piece on the caliper, and it looks pretty darn centered. So after getting the camera out of the way and taking a little bit more thorough look at this caliper, I actually decided to take it back off and put the 1.5mm spacers on and take the 1mm off. I think that actually does just a bit better job centering the rotor inside the caliper. Your mileage may differ on that. Just do your test fitting until you feel like it's perfectly centered. You can even take these measurements if you want. Just remember you only have 0.5mm increments for adjusting this distance. Once you're happy with that, let's go ahead and take everything back apart, apply our Loctite, and put it back together and properly torque it. Now looking at these bolts that hold the bracket to the caliper, I'm actually not going to be able to torque these down with it installed. You're either going to need to clamp this unit in a vise to torque these down, or what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rotor off, install this, and then torque it on the car, take it back off, and slide the rotor on. It's a little bit of extra on and off, but I think it'll be worth it to make sure we get that unit torqued properly. Here is my caliper. Now remember, when we take these bolts off here, we not only have washers right behind the bolt, but we have it between the caliper and the adapter bracket. So we need to be careful we don't mix these washers up or lose them and forget to put them back on. So I'm going to loosen them both. I'm going to take the bottom one all the way out. And as the bolt starts to come out, I'm going to grab the washer and the bolt together, take this and set it down. I'm going to let the other washer slide out. So this is the 1.5mm that needs to go back in. Put some blue thread locker on it. Swing our caliper up. Put our bolt through, take our washer, put it on the back side and kind of hold it all together, and then swing it in and start our bolt. I'm going to leave this one loose because I'm going to kind of do the same thing for the top. Bolt and washer together, put our Loctite on it, set the bolt through, take our washer, set it on the bolt, slide it up, and start the bolt. Now we can go ahead and snug the bolts down. All right, we're going to torque these to 49 pound-feet of torque. I'm going to actually torque these in stages. I'm going to torque them about halfway, then come back and do it all the way. Again, if you have a vise or something, you don't have to do all of this. I just don't have a shop vise that I want to put this in, so this was an easy way to hold the caliper and carrier so that I could torque it properly. Now we got to take this back off, put our rotor on, and then put it all back together. I'm going to take my bolts, and I'm going to put a little bit of Loctite on these too. Take our caliper and bracket. Those bolts started. Loctite on this one. Snug these babies down. We're going to torque these carrier bolts to 92 pound-feet of torque. Next, let's get our new brake line on. So here is our new braided brake line. This is the side that goes up to the top and attaches to the hard line for the car. And this is the side that goes into the caliper. We have this little adapter piece that we need to install. So we'll take the caps that came with it off. Guys, save these caps. These caps come in handy so much. Don't throw these out. We're gonna need to do a little bit of test fitting on this caliper and line. This piece just installs where it installs, so it's not that big of a deal. It's going to install this way into the caliper. So this side goes in the caliper. The side with the cone, that goes into the hose. You can see this is kind of concave. This is convex. They go together. You don't need any thread tape or anything on this type of fitting. I'm gonna put a tiny bit of thread sealer on this. Not that much though, you really don't want to overdo it. Let's go ahead and take our little cover sticker off of our caliper. You can use the PTFE tape if you'd prefer. I like the liquid stuff. Just a little bit, like it doesn't really even take much. Even though this looks like a lot, I'm gonna end up wiping most of this off. Another big thing, you don't wanna get any on the inside here because we don't want this inside of our brake caliper. We'll take that and we'll install it in our caliper and go ahead and tighten this down. That's good and tight, the proper German torque spec. Once you have this fitting installed, let's go ahead and just snug down our brake line. This is also gonna be kind of a test fit, so we don't wanna tighten it down all the way. Just kind of snug, that way we can rotate it and move it into place. Odds are this 90-degree bend is gonna face up, so I'm gonna kind of position it there. Then I'm gonna just follow the path that the OE brake line went, which is gonna be through this bracket. Now there's not a grommet here right now, but we're gonna handle that before we're done. And then I'm gonna take the brake line, which is over on this side, and just set it right where the factory one went. I also want my steering wheel to be straight here. That's just gonna give me a little bit more room to fit our brake line. Here's our brake line. Notice it's like a hex cut right here. This is actually to hold it into the bracket for the brake line. So this is why we want to do this one second. We want to make sure when we install this that the rest of our brake line is not all twisted and knotted up. So we'll go ahead and remove our towel here, and we'll just take our brake hose and we'll slide it right up. Now you notice you're only seeing half of that hex. I like to start these by hand because they get a little delicate. Also not a bad idea to clean this fitting off before you start, and then go ahead and snug it down. Wipe off any brake fluid. That stuff's pretty nasty for paint and anything else, really. Next, we need to do a really thorough inspection of that line. Make sure it's not twisted in any kind of way. And we want to make sure it follows the same path that the OEM one did to prevent any binding. Also not a bad idea to move the wheel back and forth and inspect the line to be sure it's not going to hit anything or catch anything. Once you've made sure that we're not going to have any binding or kinking or anything of the hose, let's go ahead and tighten down this 90-degree fitting. You want to counter hold the 11 millimeter that goes into the caliper and tighten down the 13. You also want to hold the line to make sure that as we tighten it, it doesn't get pushed out of position. Now our factory hose ran through this bracket. Our new hose does not have that grommet. So I actually tried to stretch the factory one over this hose. I couldn't get it stretched because, well, it broke right in half. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this grommet from our old factory hose. I'm going to put the hose in it, the new hose in it, and then I'm going to install it like that. It's not going to keep it from moving completely, but at least it'll hold it in place and prevent it from rubbing and chafing. If you want, you can drop a little bit of glue to glue that grommet back together, but I'm going to leave it like that and see how it does. Of course, we'll take the car on a test drive and be sure that we don't have any kinking or binding or the hose rubs anywhere. Now that we got the line and everything else on, time to drop our brake pads in. We need to take out this screw right here. This is an Allen head screw with a 3/16 head. I actually had to go buy this socket to install these brakes. Set that to the side. Now we got to take our spring off. We just lift that up and over again. We can just leave it right there. We'll take our brake pads. We can see it's got two holes right here. These pieces of the spring go into the holes like this. Set one pad in. Of course, make sure the friction material goes towards the rotor. Slide our spring in, line our holes up on our pads. All right, now we got our spring on. We'll go ahead and put our bolt back in. Next step is to do the driver's side. Then what we're going to do is we're going to come back, bleed both new front calipers. Then what we're going to do is we're going to flush the rear brakes, make sure we got all new fluid in our whole brake system. When it comes to either flushing or bleeding brakes, I like to use a pressure bleeder. This is the way VW and Audi recommend that you flush brakes. You have a small fitting that goes on the brake fluid reservoir. We fill this up with good quality clean brake fluid, pump it up a bunch of times to build pressure, then we just go around, crack the bleeder open, wait till clean fluid comes out. This one came from my man Paul at Shop DAP. I'll put a link down to it. You can check that out. We're going to be using .4 brake fluid, of course. This should be more than enough to bleed any air out of the front calipers, as well as flush any dirty, old, nasty fluid out of the back. All right, that's empty. Put our cap on. We're going to go hook this up to the car. It's also a good idea to bring some brake cleaner around to each wheel with you so you can clean up any brake fluid that spills. We'll start by taking our brake fluid cap off. Set that to the side. Grab our fitting for our flush tool. Make sure you get that on right, otherwise you'll have a mess of brake fluid. Next, we will take our quick connect fitting from our brake flush machine. Put that on. And we'll go ahead and pump that up to about 1 bar. If you have a really old brake fluid reservoir, you probably don't want to pump it up that much. If you're doing something like bleeding a clutch, you might actually need to go up to 2 bar. Now, you probably noticed that this caliper actually has 4 bleeders, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom. We don't want to open the ones on the bottom. That's not going to help us bleed any air out at all. We only want to work on the ones on the top. We're going to need to bleed the inner one and the outer one. Also, this actually has 2 separate pieces to the bleeder, the small brass piece and the black piece on top. Don't touch the brass piece, only the top piece. This top one is actually the bleeder. This is just a fitting. We got our little hose on our bleeder. We'll just go ahead and crack this bleeder open. You can see there was the air. Now we got fluid coming out. This is some of the fluid we already got out. It's pretty nasty. You want to open and close this a couple of times and then check for air bubbles on that first time you open it. We want to do the same thing for the bleeder on the back side. Once you feel like you got the air out of this caliper, go ahead and go inside the vehicle and pump the brakes a few times and see how the pedal feels. And we're going to do the same thing on the other side. All right, now that we have the fronts pre-bled, let's go ahead and flush the rest of the system. We'll start with the wheel furthest from the master cylinder, which is going to be the right rear. Pop our dust cap off. Go ahead and open up our bleeder. See how nasty that fluid really is coming out of there. We're just gonna let this bleed until our fluid comes out clean. Should be pretty much clear, not have that brownish tint to it. This is the longest line in the car, so this one usually takes a little while. Every once in a while, you want to go up to the front of the car and check the tool and make sure it's not running low on brake fluid. All right, once your fluid's coming out clean, we'll go ahead and lock this bleeder down. Put your dust cap back on. We're going to do the left rear exactly the same way we did the right. You really get a good idea of how dirty that brake fluid actually was. Once the fluid's clean, go ahead and close your bleeder. Put your dust cap on. Now we're going to move back to the right front. The first time we did the brakes in the front that we just replaced was more of a bleeding rather than a flushing. That's to get all the air out of the new caliper. Now we're really just going back and double checking to make sure we got it all and that there's no more air or dirty fluid in the system. All right, our outer bleeder is good. We'll go ahead and do our inner bleeder. And finally, we'll go ahead and do the left front one more time. Now, you'll notice that our brake fluid reservoir is completely filled. We don't want to just jam the cap on and leave it that way. So what I like to do is take one of these super affordable $1 turkey basters and just extract enough fluid to bring the level down. You got to put a little back, that's no big deal. And we can take this and dump this with the rest of our old brake fluid. Get your cap, put your cap back on, wipe off any excessive brake fluid that might have spilled. After you've bled the brakes and everything's happy, go ahead and give it one more cleaning with some brake cleaner to get any dirt that you may have accidentally got on the rotor off. Even though we did a good job cleaning beforehand, there's still some dirt on this rag. All right, let's give our work one final check over. make sure we got everybody happy, healthy. We put our brake pads in the right way. Our bolts are torqued. Our line looks good. Next, we got to put the wheels on and do probably one of the most forgotten parts of a brake job: bed in our new pads. It's time to take it on a test drive. What we need to make sure we do is we follow the manufacturer's recommendations for bedding in the brakes. This might be the most overlooked thing when someone does a brake job. Properly bedding in the new brake pads and rotors can make all the difference in your brake's performance. So be sure to follow the manufacturer's recommendation for how they want you to bed in your pads. For the Wilwoods that we just installed, we need to slowly build up the heat in the brake pads and rotors. What we're going to do is a series of light stops, holding the pedal down for about 3 to 5 seconds, then letting off of it and just cruising for about double that time. So if we hold the brakes for 5 seconds, we let off and let it cool down for 10 seconds. After we build up some heat, we're going to do a little bit more aggressive stopping. Once we have the brakes good and warmed up, we're going to do 8 to 10 heavy deacceleration slowdowns. We're going to get up to about 65 miles an hour and do an aggressive brake down to about 25 miles per hour. In between that heavy deceleration, we want to make sure we allow the brakes to cool. So we'll slow down to 25, we'll speed back up, we'll cruise for a minute, then we'll give it another heavy brake. This will slowly build up the heat in the brakes and then properly mate the brake pad to the new rotor. We also want to avoid stopping and sitting with the brakes applied. That can actually lead to heat spotting one spot in the rotor, and we don't want that. When we stop and park the car, we also don't want to put the parking brake on because that'll kind of do the same thing. We didn't install new rear brakes, so it's not something I'm worried about, but if you did rear brakes, you want to make sure you pay attention to that. Of course, we need to make sure we obey all local laws and don't do this somewhere unsafe. I just got back from the test drive for bedding in the brake pads. The car stops phenomenal. It was interesting to see that increase in braking performance as the pads got hot and really settled in. Now we got to do a visual inspection on everything we just did, make sure we don't have any leaks, any binding, any rubbing for that new brake line that we put in. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Big ups to Momentum Motor Parts for giving me a slamming deal on those brakes. Of course, I'll put links to everything we talked about today down in the description. Guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again next time.